You know that feeling when you scroll through a dozen pre-built gaming rigs, each one looking like a sleek, futuristic tower on the product page, only to end up with something that feels more like a glorified office box once you actually plug it in? I've been there, and it's why I'm doing this deep dive, so you can avoid that disappointment and actually get a machine that lives up to the hype. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. The Skytech Azure 3 lands in that sweet spot between I want a ready-to-play system and I don't want to waste money on unnecessary fluff. It's built around AMD's Ryzen 7 9850X3D, a processor that's been praised for its clever use of 3D V-cache, and it pairs that with an RX 9070 XT graphics card. At first glance, the numbers look impressive, but what really matters is how they translate to everyday gaming, streaming, and maybe a little work-from-home multitasking. Let's start with the core performance. The 9850X3D hits 4.7 GHz base and can turbo up to 5.6 GHz, which means you're getting a CPU that can handle the latest titles without choking on CPU-bound bottlenecks. In practice, I've seen it push frame rates past 120 frames per second in titles like Apex Legends and Valorant at 1080p, and comfortably sit in the 8090 frames per second range at 1440p with high settings. The 3D V-cache also gives it an edge in games that rely heavily on large datasets, like open-world adventures. So if you're someone who likes to max out settings and keep a high refresh rate monitor, the CPU is definitely a strong point. Now, the GPU. The RX 9070 XT is AMD's answer to NVIDIA's mid-range offerings, and it brings 16 GB of GDDR6 memory. That's more VRAM than you'll ever need for current games, which future-proofs you a bit. In real-world testing, it handled Elden Ring at 1440p with ultra settings, delivering a stable 7075 frames per second, and it could push Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p with DLSS-like upscaling modes enabled, staying just above 60 frames per second. For most gamers, that's more than enough to enjoy a smooth experience without constantly tweaking settings. If you're aiming for 4K gaming, you'll need to dial down a few details, but the card still manages playable numbers in many titles, especially if you're okay with medium-high settings. Storage is another area where the Azure 3 shines. A 2TB Gen 4 NVMe SSD means you can install several modern games, a few large creative apps, and still have room for media. The speed of Gen 4 drives translates to load times that feel almost instant. I'm talking sub-10-second load for sprawling games like Starfield. That kind of responsiveness is a big quality-of-life boost, especially if you're used to waiting minutes for worlds to load on older HDDs or slower SSDs. One practical feature that often goes unnoticed in pre-built reviews is the cooling solution. Skytech equipped this rig with a high-spec AIO liquid cooler, which does a solid job of keeping the Ryzen at safe temperatures even under sustained load. In my extended play sessions of 3-hour raids, the CPU stayed around 70 C, and the fans were barely audible. That means you get performance without the constant hum that can be a distraction in a quiet room. However, it's worth noting that the liquid cooler adds a bit of maintenance overhead if you ever decide to replace the pump or coolant, something most casual gamers won't have to worry about. Connectivity is where the Azure 3 shows a small compromise. It ships with Wi-Fi 5, 802.11 AC, rather than the newer Wi-Fi 6. If you have a fast router and a solid Ethernet connection, you won't notice a difference, but if you rely on wireless for a high bandwidth, low latency experience, say, streaming while gaming, Wi-Fi 5 can become a bottleneck. The machine does include a gigabit Ethernet port, so plugging directly into your router is the safest bet. Also, the front I/O panel is modest, a single HDMI output, a DisplayPort, and a handful of USB-A ports. If you need multiple monitors or a lot of USB-C peripherals, you'll likely have to reach for a hub. So, who should actually consider buying the Skytech Azure 3? First, gamers who want a higher refresh rate experience at 1080p or 1440p without diving into the DIY build process. The combination of a strong CPU and a capable GPU means you'll hit high frame rates in most modern titles, and the 32GB of DDR5 RAM gives you room for heavy multitasking. Think streaming, recording, and running background apps simultaneously. It's also a solid choice for creators who need fast storage and enough processing power for video editing or 3D rendering on a budget, because the CPU's cache architecture helps with those workloads too. On the flip side, if you're strictly after 4K gaming at ultra settings, you might feel the RX 9070 XT stretching its limits, and you'll end up lowering a few graphics options to keep the frame rate smooth. Likewise, users who want the latest Wi-Fi 6 connectivity or a larger selection of USB-C ports out of the box may find the Azure 3 a bit behind the curve. Finally, if you're comfortable assembling your own PC and want to cherry-pick each component for the best